And, still talking back, "You filthy black rat! You're lucky you're even breathing, you old black hag!" The cop screamed, straight into the face of an elderly woman. Her breath labored, blood dripping from her forehead onto her faded floral blouse. He punched, slapped, and choked her like she was nothing more than a rag doll. He kicked her grocery basket into the street, just because she wouldn't call him sir. But there's one thing he didn't know. She was the mother of a man who commands the respect of the entire Pentagon. Watch until the end and ask yourself, does justice still exist in America? Marlene Westfield walked this same path every morning, from a rundown apartment block at the end of the street to the bus stop near the main market. She carried a fabric basket lightly in her right hand, inside it an old loaf of bread, bought the day before, a carton of eggs cushioned by newspaper, and a bundle of vegetables tied with a green rubber band. She was 73 years old, her legs slightly swollen from arthritis, but her posture remained upright. She wore a faded, light blue floral blouse with a worn collar, khaki pants washed pale, and a pair of rubber sandals cracked at the heels. Her eyes stayed wide open, not out of fear, but from habit, shaped by winters spent with no one beside her. The morning street wasn't crowded. The sound of car horns and voices calling out from the corner store filled the air like part of a familiar backdrop. She nodded at a young boy waiting for his mother outside the pharmacy, exhaling gently into the fuel-scented breeze. The bus stop was fewer than 50 steps away, but she never walked quickly. She knew that even the most routine moments could become a reason for trouble if she took one wrong step. No one ever taught her that. Life had done the job better than any curriculum ever could. The roar of an engine behind her made her turn around. A black and white patrol car screeched to a stop, skidding past the painted line and mounting the curb. Its front wheels halted just a few handspans from her basket. The door flung open with a gust of wind. A young officer leapt out, adjusting his belt with his right hand, yanking at a loose nameplate with his left. Cole Brennan. He was tall, with a red welt still fresh under his chin, probably from a fight the night before. His eyes scanned like a predator's, locking instantly when they landed on her. He didn't ask her name, he didn't request identification. His gaze fixated on her skin, her age, and the old basket in her hand as if they were personal insults. His voice cracked the air, sharp, cold. "What the hell are you doing wandering around here?" It wasn't a question. It was a sentence passed before the accused had the chance to speak. Marlene stopped, stood her ground, and looked at him with eyes as steady as bricks laid 3 generations ago without ever cracking. "I'm just crossing the street to get to the bus stop." Her voice was clear, not loud. Each word seemed chosen to make clear there was no reason to detain her, but Cole smirked, a twisted grin. He didn't like the way she spoke, or the way she stood without trembling. He wanted her to plead, but all he got was composure, and to him that was an offense. Stepping closer, he snarled, "Do you know who the hell you're talking to, you disrespectful old hag?" Without waiting for a response, he reached out and snatched the basket from her grip, yanking so hard her body leaned sideways. An egg fell and cracked on the dusty street. He flung the basket behind him, letting the eggs and vegetables scatter across the sidewalk like she had dumped trash. As she bent down to pick them up, he nudged her sandal with his boot, knocking her off balance. "I asked you a question and you're still standing there arguing," he hissed through clenched teeth, stepping right into her face. His breath reeked of last night's liquor. She looked up, her gaze unshaken. That was the moment he truly lost control, not because she fought back, but because she refused to fear him. And in Cole Brennan's mind, those who didn't fear him needed to be broken. He rolled his shoulder, clenched his neck, and tightened his fist. The store window beside them reflected the scene in slow motion. There was no scream, no warning, only his boot crushing the loaf of bread that had fallen from her basket. And in that single moment, what began as a normal morning turned into something that would bring the entire nation to a standstill. Marlene stepped half a pace back. Her gaze remained steady, but her arms dropped slightly, as if her aging body were weighing the choice between preserving a shred of dignity or retreating to avoid something worse. The wind caught the corner of her collar and lifted it gently. Cole Brennan didn't notice. All he saw was a shadow in his way, something he believed he had the right to erase from the scene. "I was just crossing the street. I didn't break any law." she said softly, evenly, directly. Her voice wasn't weak, but it wasn't trying to sound strong either. It was plain, the way she used to speak to kids fighting at the community center. Stop it, don't do something you'll be ashamed of later. But words like that didn't reach whatever scraps of reason Cole had left. He heard them and laughed, not a vulgar laugh, but a sharp snap, as if insulted. "You talking back to me, you disrespectful old hag?" he roared, stepping forward, and in an instant, every notion of restraint vanished. His fist launched into her face like a reflex honed through years without consequence. The sound of cheekbone against knuckle was short and sharp, like a dry branch snapping. Her head jerked sideways, hair flying loose, her feet slipping backward in an awkward stumble. No one her age could withstand a blow like that. She staggered, but before she could regain her footing, he grabbed her collar, yanked her downward, and locked his hand around her neck. His thumb dug deep into the soft, wrinkled skin, while the other hand clamped her shoulder like holding down a chicken before slaughter. "You want to die today? Is that it?" He hissed through his teeth, his face so close she could smell the rot between them. He didn't need a reason. He just needed to see her submit. She tried to grip his hand. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but because blood couldn't reach her brain fast enough. Her body began to spasm, her spine warping grotesquely. She had no strength left. Only her right foot dragged slightly across the pavement, searching for grip, a pure survival reflex. Her eyes no longer looked at him, but past him, toward the bus stop sign just ahead. That was when he tightened once more. His eyes went wide. A raw, unfiltered satisfaction gleamed across his face. He snarled one final time, "Trash, old woman. Stop looking at me like that." And when his grip loosened, her body collapsed like an empty raincoat, back bent, neck twisted, face pressed against the crumbled edge of a sidewalk drain. The entire space around them seemed drained of sound. The other officer remained at the front of the car, sipping coffee from the drive-thru as if nothing had happened. A young man started to rush over but froze at Cole's warning glare. Cole bent down, held a finger near her nose, then sneered, still breathing. "Damn nuisance." He stood up and walked back to the car like someone brushing weeds off the roadside. Looking down at his shoes, he brushed off a few specks of dirt from the blow, then tossed out one final line. "Another good day's work." And the wind blew again, carrying away the sound of tires rolling over the curb, right where a human being had just been assaulted, as if she'd never had a name. Ray walked slowly from the other side of the car, still holding a steaming paper cup of coffee. He lifted his foot and nudged the scattered basket to the side. Food that had spilled earlier now lay near the edge of the drain, the loaf soaked in blood, vegetables crushed and torn. But what bothered him most was the sound the basket made, a dry, brittle thud as it hit the pavement, like a quiet complaint in the middle of silence. He didn't like being disturbed. "That's what you get for not cooperating," Ray muttered, then kicked the basket squarely, sending it flying into the street like excess garbage. An unbroken egg rolled out and exploded beneath a passing car tire. The faint stench mingled with a distant car horn, but Ray didn't turn around. His eyes were fixed on the woman's body, stirring slightly on the ground. Marlene hadn't fully regained consciousness, but her fingers twitched, as if in one final effort to lift herself. He stepped forward, about to roll her onto her back with his foot, but then he paused. Something across the street had caught his eye. A light-skinned young man, in his early 20s, was holding a phone raised halfway in front of him. He stood near an old newsstand, his face pale but his eyes brimming with hesitation. The way he held the phone at chest height, pointed toward Marlene and the two officers, made it clear his heart was pounding harder than his grip. But he didn't run. He didn't turn away like the others. Ray noticed and glanced at Cole, as if awaiting a signal. Cole shrugged and gave a crooked grin, as if giving the go-ahead. Keep it light. So Ray stepped fully into the street, coffee still in hand, moving toward the young man. Each step seemed to press deeper into the already fractured concrete. "What the hell are you recording?" he growled. Not loudly, but loud enough to cut through the space between both sides of the street. The young man flinched and took a step back. Ray kept advancing. "You want to die in place of that old lady?" He emphasized each word. the cup in his hand still perfectly upright, as if threatening people was second nature to him. His face drew closer, his breath closer, and the safe distance vanished as he reached out to grab the phone. The young man clutched it tighter. His lips pressed thin, but his hands had already begun to shake. A woman near the vegetable stall spoke up. "He's just filming. What's the problem?" Ray spun around. "You all want to be famous on the evening news for the wrong reason?" It didn't sound like an empty threat. It was soaked in the menace of a man who knew his badge protected him, backed by a system ready to turn any dissenter into a perceived threat. The woman pulled down the tarp over her vegetable stand, covering even her face. The young man slid his phone into his pocket, still watching Marlene, but his legs had weakened. He didn't turn away, but he could no longer stand tall. Ray turned back and took his first sip of coffee that morning. "This stuff's so damn stupid," he said vaguely, unclear whether he meant the bland drink, the elderly woman lying on the ground, or the people who had just watched everything unfold. At his feet, the basket lay face down, its handle torn apart, like a shred of dignity ripped open in the middle of the street. Cole stood still for a moment, looking at Marlene's body slumped beside the storm drain. Her gray hair was matted with dust, her hand still trembling, as if her body hadn't fully surrendered. He didn't bend down to check her breath. He simply walked forward, slowly, as if he were approaching to finish what hadn't been completed. He bent down, not to help her up, but to spit. A glob of saliva slid from his lips and landed straight on her neck, splashing onto the edge of her floral blouse, already stained with grime. Cole looked at what he had done with a cold, satisfied gaze. "Filth like you is what's ruining this city." He spat again, this time without bending, letting what he considered a sentence fall upon her in the most degrading way possible. No one stopped him. Ray leaned against the hood, one hand resting casually on the car, coffee still half full. The bystanders, whether close or far, all pulled back, into stalls, behind windows, or into the reflexive shelter of fear. Something dry and aching spread through the air. The realization among the crowd that what they had just seen wasn't an accident, but a warning to anyone who dared believe they could be treated like a human being in this place. Cole grabbed her arm and yanked her upright. Her body twitched slightly and the back of her sandal scraped along the ground, producing a faint hiss against the dust and gravel. Her head slumped to the side, a pulse fluttering at her temple. But he didn't care. He just wanted her out of his sight as quickly as possible. Like an eyesore, like a bag of garbage dumped in the wrong place that needed to be hauled away. The car door swung open with a dry snap. Cole dragged her there without supporting her neck, without balancing her weight. As he lifted her, her legs brushed against the pavement, her head tilted outward. Then a sharp tug slammed her temple against the steel door frame. The dull, heavy sound that followed left no room for doubt. Blood began to seep from her nose and hairline, tracing a line down her jaw and soaking into her shoulder. Across the street, a young woman at the vegetable stand bit her lip until it bled, yet still didn't dare call out to anyone. A boy holding a notebook inside a corner store turned away, one small arm raised to cover his eyes, instinctively understanding that not every place in broad daylight was safe. Somewhere in the crowd, a lonely sigh slipped out, but no one stepped forward. In that moment when someone needed to stand still, no one did. Cole slammed the car door shut, dust rising from the dry ground. He didn't look back at her, didn't check whether she was alive or not. He simply climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, as if he had just finished a routine task. The tires rolled away down a street that once knew peace, leaving behind a long trail of wrongdoing that everyone saw, but no one dared to name. At the emergency department of the Central Hospital, 3 doctors stood around the bed of patient number 9, eyes fixed on the freshly printed CT scan results. The image clearly showed a subdural hematoma on the right side, spreading and starting to compress the ventricles. The lead physician, Dr. Carson, pointed to a blurred spot on the film, his voice turning low. Severe brain trauma, internal bleeding, progressive cerebral edema. He glanced at the nurse who had just finished recording the Glasgow score, still scribbling in her notes. Deep unconsciousness, score of 3. No one said anything else. In the emergency room, cases this serious always came with a particular kind of silence. the silence of those who had seen, more than once, a patient slip into a state that no longer qualified as fainting or unconsciousness. At this level, they used only one word: coma, and not the shallow kind from a minor blow. This was something dark, deep, and uncertain, a condition that put the entire brain on highest alert. Marlene was fitted with an IV line, her head wrapped in gauze, a small patch of hair shaved off to insert an intracranial pressure sensor. Her arm was thin, veins visible, but still showed a basic response to pain stimuli, the only thing that allowed a sliver of hope to survive. The monitor beeped in steady tones. A young nurse glanced at the EEG chart and turned away, unable to hide her discomfort. "Marlene was attacked? Do we have any information from the police yet?" "Yes," another doctor replied, holding a photocopy of the police report just sent over. They wrote, "Subject fell while resisting law enforcement." The sterile phrasing on white paper left a bitter aftertaste, sharper than the sound of machines surrounding the bed. Dr. Carson looked at the CT film again, frowning. "Fell? With an impact force deep enough to cause this level of bleeding?" He didn't finish the rest. Everyone in the room understood. Accidents rarely leave trauma this severe, unless the impact was violently forceful or deliberately inflicted. At that moment, the door swung open. A uniformed police officer stepped in, tall and thin, his face lined from a sleepless night. He approached the intake desk, set down a report sheet, and spoke quickly in the flat tone of routine bureaucracy. "Her name is Marlene Westfield, 73 years old, no family present, no immediate threat to life, but monitor closely. We'll collect full records later." The nurse accepted the paper, nodded, and asked nothing more. They were too used to reports that read like lost item claims. No one questioned why she had been brought in, because the admission form simply noted "fell during administrative processing." But Dr. Carson looked at her again, longer than necessary. He had once served as a military doctor, and he knew exactly what a real blow looked like. What he saw on her was not the result of a fall. It bore the mark of power, striking someone too defenseless to fight back. He didn't say that out loud. He simply pulled the thin blanket up over the patient's chest, then stepped back quietly. In the hallway, the shift carried on as usual. The rolling carts, the clatter of shoes on tile, and the rustle of paperwork all continued in rhythm. Only one thing felt different in the ER that morning. An elderly woman had fallen into a deep coma from injuries no one would name properly, and a report had already been written. The ending before the truth had any chance to speak. Down the whitewashed corridor of the intensive care unit, where time didn't flow but ticked along with each artificial heartbeat, a young nurse named Laura stepped out of room number 9. She leaned against the wall beneath the Quiet Zone sign, hands clasped in front of her, as if trying to steady herself more than rest. Her face showed little, but her eyes held an unsettled question, not yet shaped into words, like she had brushed against something in her shift that left her uneasy. A coworker asked softly, "You all right?" She nodded, but after a pause, Laura lowered her voice. "She's just an old lady. Did they need to use force?" The question wasn't aimed at anyone, nor did it seek an answer. It was tossed like a pebble into the still surface of medical routine, one that functioned solely on data and documentation. She knew that, and perhaps because she knew it so well, she needed to say it out loud, just once, to remind herself she was still disturbed by what wasn't normal. She walked back into the room and gently adjusted the IV line. The heartbeat on the monitor remained steady, but slow. A consistent wave rose and dipped across the black screen and blue light, as if life itself were trying to cling to each unit of time, one breath at a time. On the bed, Marlene lay on her side, one half of her face bruised, her breathing reduced to faint suction sounds slipping through the narrow oxygen tubes. Her eyes remained closed, but the muscles around her jaw twitched slightly, a sign that the subconscious was still alive somewhere in the shadows of a coma. Laura sat by the bedside, using a warm cloth to wipe the patient's neck gently. The bruising extended from the jawline to the back of the neck, uneven, as if someone had gripped it in segments. She had seen many victims of assault, but this time what chilled her was not the injuries. There was absolute silence in the paperwork. Every form labeled the case as assault against a law enforcement officer, a familiar phrase used like a chemical wash that erased all ethical question. While changing the bandage, Laura listened to the steady pulse of the IV pump. Then, as if by instinct, she leaned in closer when she saw the patient's lips quiver slightly. At first, she thought she had misheard, but as she sat even closer, her hand resting near Marlene's, she became certain. A tiny, fragmented sound was slipping out of those cracked lips, like words escaping from a collapsing vault of memory. "Don't call him." The voice was so faint that anyone not paying close attention would have dismissed it as irregular breathing. But Laura held her breath, leaning closer. "Don't let him know." The final syllable was barely a whisper of air against the tongue, but it was enough to make Laura sit upright. She looked around. It was just her and the old woman in the room. The short sentence included no names and referenced no relationship directly, but the way it was spoken, with the last lingering breath clinging to her lips, made it heavier than a final wish. Laura felt her skin grow colder by the second. A kind of instinct took hold, not born of medicine, but of human awareness, recognizing that the woman lying there had lived through things unimaginable and was trying to hold on to something vital before disappearing completely into the darkness where no one could be called. She didn't write the words into the record, but she stored them in her memory the way one records the coordinates of a storm yet to be named. Out in the hallway, the rotating shift light had begun to glow. Laura stood, adjusted the blanket, then turned off the main light, leaving only a dim lamp glowing in the corner. And as she stepped out, she glanced through the window one last time, saying nothing. Because some things, once whispered, will find their way to become true. Nearly 700 miles from the civilian hospital, inside a military command post deep within the Appalachian Mountains, the internal monitoring system operated in an almost fully automated state. This was not a place that received orders. It was a place that issued them. The operations center housed more than 40 personnel, but each individual focused on only a fragment of the larger picture. Data flowed continuously, but only a handful of names had the power to halt the entire process in its tracks. On the main screen, located in the second-floor analysis room, a line of dark red text appeared. There was no alarm, only an encoded symbol followed by the alert, name reserved. Immediately after, the name was displayed in full, Marlene A. Westfield. That phrase came with no image, no medical record, no military ID or operational code, but the system knew exactly what to do when that name appeared. A field-grade officer had just exited a meeting with intelligence advisors, still holding a packet of analysis on the Southern Defense Corridor, when his assistant called him quietly. He stopped, looked at the screen, then asked in a low voice, "Source of trigger?" The assistant typed quickly, "Civilian hospital data, 17th city in the southeast. Auto report from the Federal Medical Link System." The officer did not blink, eyes locked on the name as if trying to remember where he had heard it before. A few seconds later, he set the packet down and pulled a card from his chest pocket. It bore the Pentagon seal, embossed beneath a layer of clear laminate. He scanned it at the encrypted terminal, prompting the bank of monitors to switch from data mode to direct access mode. Only those who had served in Level 4 response units understood what was happening. Everyone else, including the assistant, knew better than to ask. With each verified character, layers of outdated data began peeling away. Beneath the name Marlene A. Westfield were lines of unfamiliar code. No date of birth, no political history. Instead, there was a single silver line of text. Direct link. Directive Pentagon watch list. No additional explanation. In the military world, that wasn't an order, it was a warning. The field officer sat down in his chair, not because he was told to, but because experience had taught him that this kind of situation no longer belonged to strategic command. It had entered the gray zone of absolute authority. He typed into the terminal, initiating an emergency relay to Washington. The data packets were encrypted in under 20 seconds and uploaded to a secure channel accessible only to those at the level of the National Security Council. Meanwhile, in the corner of the room, a secondary monitor displayed a map of civilian LIC systems. A red dot blinked at the location of the hospital's signal source, but no one was paying attention to geography anymore. All focus had shifted to the name that had passed through 3 layers of interagency verification without needing justification. This system was designed to react only when national threats were detected, and yet today, it had mobilized solely because of a woman lying in an emergency room with a nearly blank civilian record. The officer stood up, his gaze darkening by half a beat. He didn't ask why her name appeared. The real question now was why she had been there, and why someone didn't want anyone to know she had been there. The next order recorded in the log read, "Forward the information directly to the Pentagon Watch List Special Identifier Code. Do not trigger public protocols. Maintain continuous monitoring of the patient's condition." There was no meeting, no chain of complex commands. One person had just become the focal point of a surveillance system reserved exclusively for nationally strategic sensitive sites. Under the cold glow of the control screen, a red symbol flashed on the internal interface. A string of identifiers was instantly activated. Subject: Marlene Westfield. Priority tag: Omega Clearance. A security officer managing the routine data reports froze. He stared at the name that had just appeared, then quickly entered a top-level encryption string. The system immediately responded, unlocking a file that no one in his unit had ever accessed. The photo displayed an elderly woman with thinning gray hair and deep facial wrinkles, looking no different from any senior resident in a low-income neighborhood. But the heading above stated clearly, "Biological Mother, General Bryson Westfield, Strategic Commander, Black Phantom Unit." No one at the base dared to laugh. A few even stepped back from the screen. The name of that unit had never been allowed on official platforms. No bios. In high-level security circles, the words Black Phantom alone were enough to halt conversations. This was a unit unaffiliated with any public military branch, operating under direct command from the most classified strategic division. Every member was an independent combat agent, each previously assigned to missions with no return plan. Commander Bryson Westfield had no official photo, existing only in 3 triple-encrypted memos, with a single detail known across the entire government. His only enemy is the one who harms his family. The retrieval order was encrypted and dispatched in under 20 seconds. A meeting in Wing B of the White House was abruptly paused. A military advisor presenting on East Asia hadn't even closed his laptop before being pulled into the hallway by an aide. In a private room, an internal line lit up. On the other end was a voice from the National Joint Counter-Operations Command. Calm, but every word sliced the air. "Bring her back now, at any cost." In a nation with hundreds of special operations units, people learn to distinguish between important missions and those that cannot be allowed to fail. And this time, what lay in that hospital bed wasn't an anonymous old woman. It was the mother of the man who once erased an entire enemy unit without firing a single shot. At a covert logistics station near the state border, technicians began loading topographic maps of the city. A reconnaissance drone was launched without prior reporting. All cameras around the hospital were rewound, marking timestamps of the 2 involved officers' presence. One of them, Cole Brennan, was currently sipping coffee in the patrol lounge. He had no idea that the moment he raised his hand to strike that elderly woman, his entire life trajectory had entered countdown mode. And even less did he know that, as he sneered to his partner, "That hag's probably dead," someone on the other side of the country, wearing a uniform, had just removed his glasses and said nothing further. The call ended with just 2 words: "En route." Those who remained understood perfectly. Someone was about to pay the price, and this time it would not be the victim. Beneath the soft yellow light of the command room, buried deep inside the base, the air remained thick with the scent of electronics and metal. Screens continued blinking with satellite maps. Voices in headsets delivered steady streams of information. But at the center of the room, one man stood up. Bryson Westfield removed the headset from his neck and placed it on the table with the same precision he applied to everything in his life. Everyone present, from tactical officers to communications staff, paused for a few seconds, though none dared to ask why. No explanation was needed. When Westfield abandoned a strategic briefing mid-section without leaving instructions, it meant this was no longer about military duty. It was about the only thing he placed above national security: family. He walked out of the command center with a gait that was both quiet and unshakable, triggering the security doors to open as if the system itself recognized who he was. No one looked directly at him, but everyone adjusted their posture. A recruit who had joined less than a week ago whispered to the person beside him, "Who is that?" only to be met with a firm shake of the head. Bryson Westfield's name had never been written on the base gate. His photo had never appeared in the media, but anyone who had worked within the deepest layers of the United States military knew this. He was the last thing enemies saw before everything disappeared. His black shirt was crisply ironed by his hand. The stone-gray khakis were secured with a narrow civilian belt. On his left wrist, just visible under the cuff, gleamed titanium-plated 4-star insignia, the kind recognized instantly by anyone in uniform, even without introduction. 4 stars, unstrapped, unbadged, yet enough to make people freeze. This was not a medal worn for a ceremony. It was the mark of a rank that could not be awarded by anything but the battlefield. As he descended the iron stairs leading to the underground parking bay, the echo of his footsteps hit like calibrated pressure readings. His face revealed nothing, but his gaze caused the guard to step aside by instinct alone. They had seen him call off an entire operation over one officer's ethical breach. They had heard stories of his tactical coordination that erased 62 terrorist operatives from the map without a single shot fired. But today, there was something more still than a launch command. The silence of a father walking toward a place where a life might not be saved. But justice had to be demanded at any cost. The civilian vehicle was already waiting. No driver, no escort. He opened the door himself and placed a simple gray fabric bag on the passenger seat. It wasn't a tactical kit. Inside was a printed case file, a small notebook, and a handwritten directive. He closed the door, started the engine, and didn't need to use navigation. He had memorized every corner of the city where his mother lived. The early season wind swept past the windshield, carrying the scent of dry leaves and ash. He didn't turn on the music. He made no calls. He said nothing. From this point forward, no warning would be needed. The men who assaulted that old woman had chosen the wrong target, and he, though in civilian clothes, was not coming to apologize or negotiate. He came to do the one thing he had done his entire life: protect his own, in a way that the system would never forget. Underground, in a strategic operations zone where light never pierced the thick steel walls, a young guard hurried toward the elevator that had just stopped. He saw General Westfield, tall and commanding, step out with a presence no one dared block. It was the same face, the one that never needed to shout or show anger, but this time his eyes made the hallway feel several degrees colder. The soldier stood at the entrance to the flight coordination zone, speaking softly but clearly. "Sir, do you need to request federal intervention?" Bryson Westfield stopped but didn't turn. "No need. My mother is reason enough." That reply left no room for any follow-up questions. The soldier stepped back on instinct, needing no instruction. At that moment, only one thought filled his mind. Whoever had struck her would soon face something they had never imagined, and this would not be a mission that could be buried under reports or apologies. Just 15 minutes later, the helipad on level B2 lit up with an emergency signal. A special Black Hawk pulled from a training rotation and ordered into readiness. No one asked why. No one dared to call it in. The operators simply looked at the order code sent through the command system, B Wazard 0V. It wasn't a standard emergency designation. It was a signal only 6 people in the entire military were authorized to sign, and only one had ever used. The helicopter lifted into the swirling wind without a sound, its rotors coated with detection-resistant paint, its noise canceled entirely by acoustic dampeners. On the ground, civilian radars and commercial satellites picked up no trace. No news outlet caught sight of it. Simply put, it had never existed in the official flight system. Inside the main cabin, Bryson sat alone. He wore no uniform, no nameplate, but his mind operated as if in combat. He reviewed every piece of intel just received. The blocked traffic camera footage, the falsified medical reports, and the internal records of officers Brennan and Ray, who had each been investigated 3 times for excessive force, but were repeatedly cleared under lack of definitive evidence. In his hand, a metal pen spun slowly between his fingers. It was the only item ever given to leaders of the Black Phantom unit, symbolizing one promise: never retreat when justice is twisted. Below him stretched a web of lit cities, roads connected by blinking signals and honking horns. A mask of chaos, pretending to be normal while something deep inside was rotting. But this time, he wasn't coming to patch a crack. He was coming to drag the entire system into daylight, to force it to face what it had long buried beneath layers of legality and false authority. As the helicopter crossed the state line, no checkpoint dared intervene. All communication towers received a locked-tier signal, an encryption level that forced the telecom network to clear the frequency automatically. In the cockpit, the pilot held the controls steady, flying alongside a Fury with purpose. They didn't need to ask where to. They had only heard one word from Westfield before takeoff: Precinct 12, fly low. The helicopter tore through the sky like a black arrow, unseen, unheard. But when it landed, the entire city would know the game was over, and this time, no lie would be enough to cover the blood on the hands of those who called themselves the law. Before she became a victim, beaten in the street, Marlene Westfield had lived a life no one forced her to choose, but she embraced it as naturally as breathing. She wasn't someone prominent, never received medals, or had her name mentioned in the media. During the Gulf War, she served as a frontline emergency coordinator. No gun, no body armor, just a radio, a map, and a will that never flinched, even as shells exploded only steps away. In every casualty evacuation, she was the last to leave the danger zone. After confirming no one had been left behind, a teammate once said, "Marlene is the kind of person who makes you feel ashamed if you even think about running first." She never argued, only kept working until the medical unit was disbanded due to budget cuts. Years later, when Bryson was promoted to general, the entire Pentagon sent her offers: secured housing, a personal vehicle, and a civilian protection detail if she wished. She declined them all, leaving only one line in her reply: "Don't let what my son achieved become the reason I forget who I am." She never appeared at military banquets, never gave a speech when her son received his 4th star. The only known photo of her shows her standing at the very back, wearing a plain shirt, holding a water bottle, smiling upward, not proud of the title, but proud that her son had remained the kind of man who knew what was right. Her apartment was tucked deep in a poor neighborhood near the train station. Many wondered why someone who could live anywhere in America would choose that place. She never answered until one day, during a small community meeting, someone suggested moving her to a quieter area since she was elderly. That day she smiled and looked toward the children playing in the dusty yard. "If I don't teach these kids to read, who will? Do any of you?" No one replied. She didn't need agreement. Every morning she opened her door at 6 o'clock, set out 3 old wooden tables, a bookshelf filled with large print books and colored pencils. The kids came by habit, not because of fear or enforcement, but because someone believed they could learn something good. She taught them to write their names, learn numbers, understand the meaning of signs outside hospitals, traffic warnings, and even the text on a milk carton that their families rarely could afford. Neighbors called her Miss M, a mix of respect and affection. She didn't care what they called her. What she cared about was whether the kids could spell responsibility today, and whether they remembered that when someone falls, the first thing to do is help them up, not pull out a phone to record. In her tiny living room, there was a faded poster on the wall, bearing a single line she once clipped from a wartime article: "The brave don't announce, they act." That life, so simple that no one ever thought it could be caught in a national storm, was exactly why no one recognized she was worth protecting when she was brutalized in public. And that is why this wave of outrage cannot be soothed by a speech or a public apology from the police chief. Because if this society can allow a woman who once saved hundreds of lives to be kicked in the face while carrying a basket of eggs, then the thing needing emergency care is not her. It's the entire system we still call justice. Tisha sat in the corner of the room, clutching a worn-out stuffed cat, her face streaked with red from wiping away tears with the back of her hand. The 13-year-old girl, once a victim of an addicted father and an absent mother, never imagined she'd stand in front of a camera, but this time no one asked her to. No one made her. Tisha placed the phone on the table, opened the camera, and began to record the first testimony of her life, one she finally felt brave enough to say aloud. Tisha was the only one who ever called me child. Her voice cracked on the last word, eyes glistening, as if the world had just lost something it never truly understood the value of until it was gone. She came to find me one night when I was about to jump off the third-floor railing, just because I felt like there was nothing left to hold on to. Tisha took a short breath, her throat tightening at the memory. My mom was out with her new boyfriend. The police told me to just endure a few more weeks while they figured things out. But she didn't need a warrant, didn't need to ask. She just came, sat next to me and said, "You don't have to live for anyone else, but if you stop today, you'll never see how good you can be tomorrow." The clip was only 2 minutes and 19 seconds long, but the weight of every word Tisha spoke hit straight into the hearts of those who had scrolled past images of Marlene lying motionless in the hospital without realizing who that woman once was. The child didn't need titles or praise to make people pause. She simply shared, like a soul recording what it could no longer lean on. "She's the reason I'm still here. If she hadn't taught me how to pronounce the word dignity, I'd probably still think I was worthless." When the video was first posted on Tisha's page, only a few dozen people saw it, followers from her past storytelling sessions. But by the next morning, it appeared on a major community page with a caption that read, "A girl cries because the only person who ever called her child is now in a coma after being beaten by police." And that was when the flood started. Thousands shared it, and hundreds of thousands left comments. Some simply said 3 words, "Me too." Others tagged friends and added, "Do you remember her, the one who gave us books back in 2nd grade?" Strangely, though the video touched millions, no one yet knew her real name. A still from the clip, her in a gray sweater, silver hair tied neatly behind her head, smiling as she handed a comic book to the little girl, had not been officially identified by any agency. Journalists began tracking clues, but when they asked witnesses, they only got nicknames like Miss M, the street corner reading lady, the old woman who brought extra bread for the kid. All of them were accurate, but not enough to open a formal record. There was something about that anonymity that unsettled people, as if society had just been exposed for letting a person who lived so fully be struck down on a sidewalk without anyone speaking up in time. People didn't need to know whose mother she was or see a military ID card to feel that this was wrong. They only had to look at Tisha's trembling face as she whispered her final thanks and realize if someone like her couldn't be protected, then how many other children would have to learn to protect themselves in ways they never should have to. And so no official headline was needed, because an unnamed truth sometimes frightens people more than any list of credentials ever could. For what if that name belonged to someone who once saved a life we had turned away from? That morning, a small group of people quietly appeared at the street corner where the incident had occurred. No one brought banners or loudspeakers. They only brought a large wooden sign, placed exactly where Marlene had fallen, blood spreading from her temple along the cracks of the worn-out curb. On the board, in red hand-painted letters, it read, "Where an old lady was slaughtered like a dog, in broad daylight." The words didn't scream, but the sharpness in each letter stabbed directly into the hearts of passers-by. Some paused for a few seconds, then kept walking. Some left flowers. Others stopped with their children, pointed at the sign, and said nothing. Gradually, the scent of candles, damp wood, and morning rain mixed into something unfamiliar, a feeling like a funeral, but no one had announced mourning, like a memorial, but with no speeches, only presence and eye contact between those who once believed they had no right to speak. None of them had known each other before. They came from different neighborhoods, different jobs, and different skin colors, but in their eyes they recognized a shared truth. This was no longer about one person being assaulted. It was about everyone who had ever felt invisible in the face of power. As silence began building into a kind of pressure, an anonymous email arrived in the inbox of a journalist known for investigating police misconduct. The attachment was a raw audio file, unedited, unaltered. In it, a man's voice was heard clearly, choked with rage and contempt. "You think I'm scared 'cause she's some old black bitch? Are you kidding me? These people have been leeching off this land for 100 years and still think someone owes them something." The sound was crisp, layered with the hum of patrol car engines and a bitter, jeering laugh. The sender left no name, no trace, but that no longer mattered. Anyone who had ever heard Cole Brennan on television, seen footage of him in uniform touring impoverished neighborhoods, or listened to him declare, "My department doesn't cover for anyone," could not deny it. The voice in the recording was his. The journalist didn't need a studio to verify it. She simply played the clip and compared it to past interviews. Everything matched: the way he elongated vowels when angry, how he swallowed the ends of words when mocking, and the pathetic little laugh that crept between vile phrases. The entire atmosphere of entitled, vulgar power was captured in just a few minutes, and it was enough to crush every excuse that would follow. The audio was uploaded to a decentralized sharing platform, and within hours it spread across social media groups, independent news sites, and even forums once supportive of law enforcement. The first comments weren't filled with rage. They carried something more dangerous: disillusionment. "I used to think he was just tough. I defended him, though the old lady resisted arrest. Now I realize how damn stupid I was." When the wooden sign on the street began to rot from the rain, locals replaced it with a metal plaque. But the wording remained the same. This time there was a new line underneath, painted in black, and he said, "I'm not scared 'cause she's some old black bitch." Those words were no longer hidden in internal memos or sanitized with bureaucratic jargon. They stood there on the street, beneath the eyes of adults and children alike, living proof of a hatred no system could bury forever. The audio clip of Cole Brennan's voice was aired by an independent news channel based in a neighboring state on Monday morning, in a broadcast that lasted just under 4 minutes. They didn't add lengthy commentary, no effects, no voiceover. The screen displayed only one line: "Internal recording, never before released. Judgment belongs to the public." Then Cole's voice played, raw, vile. The station's editor later said that at that very moment their server system began to overload. Comments flooded in like a breached dam, from low-income neighborhoods to college campuses, from indigenous communities to racial justice groups. People began sharing the video with captions that varied in wording but carried the same tone: outrage. A white female student from the Midwest wrote, "I used to think Cole Brennan represented tough justice. Turns out he's just a coward hiding behind a gun." A retired man who had once served in the Border Patrol wrote, "As someone who wore the uniform, let me say this. No one deserves immunity just because they wear a badge, especially not with a mouth like that." By nearly noon, a small group had gathered under the wooden sign where Marlene had been beaten, holding up hand-lettered cardboard signs in black ink. "Justice for Marlene. She taught my kid, not yours. This ain't just one cop's sickness. It's the damn system's mold." Local police were dispatched, but this time they didn't step out of their vehicles. A young officer in the passenger seat quietly lowered the sun visor and stopped looking at the crowd. By late afternoon, the news had spread to other cities. Protests began to erupt spontaneously, not sparked by any specific call to action. At a major intersection a few blocks away, hundreds stood encircling the street, phones raised to capture every moment. Among them were people Marlene had once taught to read, and others who had only just heard of her through a social media post, but all felt they could not stay silent. The chants weren't cries of despair. They were declarations. This time, don't turn away. This time, don't delete the video. This time, if he walks free, "We won't be quiet." City officials began to flounder. The sheriff's office released a brief statement saying they were reviewing the incident and initiating an internal investigation by protocol. But within 2 hours of that release, the hashtag #WeKnowHisVoice had become a trending topic. Independent commentators, civil rights attorneys, former judges, and even some who had worked alongside Cole spoke out, calling his continued wearing of the badge a disgrace to the entire profession. And yet, even as pressure mounted from media and public outrage, what Cole was about to face went far beyond anything he could imagine. He didn't know that the recording hadn't just angered the public, it had triggered the memory of someone who had stayed silent for years out of fear. That person, without prompting, without contacting any journalists, sent a handwritten letter to the state's Human Rights Commission. In it, they recounted their story, how Cole had broken 2 of their ribs during an illegal stop 7 years ago, back when he worked near a detention zone. At the time, the case had been closed, with the explanation that the victim had fallen. Now, the letter read, "If I don't speak now, I don't deserve to look myself in the mirror." And so, the worst thing for Cole was not the recording itself, it was the truth he once thought buried forever, now returning in a way the law could no longer silence, and the public no longer wished to forgive. The bar sat less than 3 blocks from the police station, a place Cole Brennan frequented every Friday night. Neon lights smeared across the golden beer in his glass as crude laughter and filthy stories spilled out without restraint. He leaned back in his chair, legs propped on the table, recounting the scene on Main Street like it was a football game he had just won in a landslide. Her head made a crack like a brick, the kind ready for the grave and still talking back to a cop. His drinking buddies roared with laughter, raising their glasses. One chimed in, "Still got that fire in you, huh?" Cole bellowed, pounding his chest. "I'm real special ops, man. Those clips don't mean shit to me. Trust me." And he truly believed it. Believed that no matter how many people protested or how many recordings leaked, he was still Untouchable Cole, as he used to be known at the department. What he didn't know was that, at that very moment, in a third-floor conference room at Central Police Headquarters, a fax machine let out a sharp buzz in the tension-choked air. The on-duty clerk, mid-tack sorting files, froze as the first line emerged from the machine. "BY emergency order from the machine." The Internal Affairs chief shot up, snatching the fax from the stunned woman's hands. Beneath the directive were 3 red seals, one from the Department of Defense, one from the Office of Federal Oversight, and one from the Military Legal Command. No polite preamble, no explanation, just a classified command stamped with absolute authority. Enforce immediately, regardless of circumstance. A rapid response meeting was launched within 10 minutes. A representative from Regional Command entered without showing ID. They carried a USB drive containing internal communications, sensitive data, and a compiled list of unprosecuted misconduct by Cole spanning 8 years. No one in the room said a word. Every entry matched complaints that had been buried or lost in records through systematic omission. When the suspension was officially announced, every internal camera in the department turned toward the front entrance. Outside, a military vehicle sat parked. No sirens, no markings, but everyone understood it wasn't from the local police. A uniformed driver stepped out, sealed envelope in hand, and stated, "I am under orders to escort Brennan to federal headquarters. No court order required. This is a national defense directive." Meanwhile, back at the bar, Cole was still laughing, lifting his 3rd glass, when a young officer stepped in, walked over, and lightly placed a hand on his shoulder. Cole turned, half joking, "What now? I'm not done partying." The officer stared at him, then pulled a document from his pocket, printed boldly with the word "immediate." Cole's face shifted from flushed red to pale gray in 3 seconds. He stammered, "What the hell is this joke? Who signed it?" The answer came from a cold voice behind him, a Pentagon official. "The one who signed it is the superior of the woman whose face you slammed into the curb. You should know who you hit." From that moment on, Cole no longer had freedom of movement, not because of a criminal arrest, but because he had entered a zone of control, where reputation, badges, and past protection no longer applied. And what frightened him more than anything was seeing the very men who had clinked glasses with him minutes earlier now lowering their heads, avoiding eye contact. The suspension order still rang in his ears as the bar descended into a frozen silence. Ray stood still at the corner of the counter, color draining from his face. The beer glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the tile floor, and no one moved to clean it. Cole sat stunned, mouth agape, no longer laughing as before. He muttered, voice caught in his throat, "What the hell? Who the hell is she?" His hand trembled as he gripped the facts. Barely half a page, but heavier than a sledgehammer. He had never seen a document with no way out, no options, no footnotes for delay or excuse. A lifetime in law enforcement had taught Cole the comfort of internal handling. If trouble arose, someone would take care of it. If a complaint came in, a superior would reframe the report to sound more palatable. He believed he was untouchable. The guy who played his cards right always kept his seat. But this time, no one stepped in. No one called to apologize on his behalf. No one picked up the phone to reach his private lawyer. What transpired? There were only averted eyes and murmurs that sliced through the air like blades. An older officer stepped out from the corner table, never raising his head, never meeting anyone's gaze, but his voice rang loud enough to silence every question in the room. "She's Westfield's mother." Ray swallowed hard, nearly stumbling backward. Cole furrowed his brow, face tightening with disbelief. "Westfield? Who? Who the hell is that?" he shouted, panic cracking through his voice. But the answer wasn't a background check, and it wasn't an introduction. The officer maintained a calm tone, as if reciting a truth everyone already knew, and slowly delivered the blow. "And you just punched America in the face." The words stopped every breath in the room. Someone turned away, another reached for their phone only to stuff it back into their pocket, afraid of even appearing curious. No one dared look Cole in the eye, as though he had crossed a line that could never be undone. Ray muttered something inaudible, a half-curse stuck in his throat. His hand gripped the table edge, trying to steady himself. But no one in that room hadn't heard of Bryson Westfield, the general authorized to deploy troops without congressional approval in cases designated as domestic security emergencies. Rumor had it that some of Westfield's missions were never recorded in any national archive, and everyone who knew anything understood. There were 3 things you didn't do in America: attack a cop, expose the identity of a special ops officer, and third, lay a hand on the mother of a 4-star general, still in active command. The shock hadn't passed when the sound of heavy engines rumbled outside. It wasn't a police cruiser, nor a journalist's SUV. It was an armored vehicle seen only in matters of national security. 2 men in plain clothes entered, offering no introductions, showing no badges. They simply looked at Cole and asked, "Can you walk, or do we need to assist you?" Cole scanned the room, hoping someone would speak up, offer a reason, or at least ask for a delay. But the room was dead silent. No one moved. No one spoke. No one dared touch the men who had entered, because they were not from the police force. They came from a place where orders needed no signatures to carry weight across the country. Cole stood up, staggering like a man unmoored. For the first time in years, he was not the one in control. His wrists weren't cuffed yet, but his steps already faltered, because he knew after tonight the name Untouchable Cole would only exist in the past tense, as a warning told in whispers: if you want to survive this system, don't be the fool who touches someone America is willing to send its military to protect. Less than 6 hours after the suspension order was faxed to the local police headquarters, an emergency meeting was convened in Washington, D.C. In a sealed room 3 floors below the Department of Justice, senior officials from the Pentagon, cabinet representatives, and the president's national security advisors took their seats one by one. There was no media, no recording equipment, and all personal electronic devices were confiscated before entering. The Director of Military Intelligence opened with a brief report. The subject's name is Marlene Westfield, currently in a state of deep coma. Her identity has been officially matched with the birth record of General Bryson Westfield, currently Strategic Commander of the Black Phantom Unit. As the sentence ended, The room's status shifted instantly from emergency to classified. The Deputy Attorney General flexed his wrist slightly and signaled the Assistant Solicitor General to stand. His voice was low and cold. This is no longer a case of police brutality against a civilian. This is a severe domestic security breach. We are now facing the potential ignition of a military response outside of legislative protocol. A member of the Homeland Security Council nodded in agreement, adding, General Westfield has full authority to initiate an autonomous tactical response if a threat is deemed to involve the safety of any relative under Level 1 classification. We allowed this to happen in front of the media within controlled territory. A digital map appeared on screen. The hospital treating Marlene had been marked with 3 concentric zones: static security, dynamic alert, and reactive containment. The Director of Homeland Security gave a concise update. The area has been soft-sealed by federal troops, and local law enforcement has been denied access to the entry systems. The state's Department of Justice has requested an explanation, but we have yet to respond. The White House Chief Counsel, who had remained upright since the beginning of the meeting, finally spoke. This is no longer about managing a local incident. The immediate priority is information control. General Westfield's identity must be completely locked down. Someone furrowed their brow, about to interject, but the counsel continued. If his name is revealed while public anger is this high, every action, even lawful, will be branded as personal military retaliation. And if that narrative spreads, we will lose control over optics, morality, and political ground. A security aide laid a printout from social media on the table. The hashtags were surging. Justice for Marlene, Stop Police Terror, Who is Westfield? More concerning, a few users had begun circulating rare, unvetted photos of General Bryson, making facial exposure increasingly likely. The Deputy Secretary of Information urged, we need authorization to intervene directly on digital platforms, temporarily suspend access to any account referencing his name or image. The White House Chief of Staff tapped the table lightly. I need confirmation. Are we all aligned on a soft but firm containment strategy to prevent this incident from escalating into a national crisis? 18 nods were recorded, not a single objection. And as the classified discussion ended sign faded from the screen, the room was left with one quiet final sentence. We cannot allow this to become the starting point of a confrontation between the military and the civil system. Outside, daylight remained, but from that moment, hundreds of social media accounts were shadowed, and every post mentioning Westfield's name vanished from search results. Inside the White House, a limited list of 6 individuals was granted full briefing access to the Westfield contingency in preparation for one singular risk. If the public discovered that Marlene was not just a victim, but the mother of a general, then the very definition of justice in this country would have to be rewritten. St. Catherine's Hospital remained under an unofficial lockdown. The main entrance had been sealed early, and all side access points were being monitored by plainclothes federal security teams. On the 3rd floor, within the special care unit for patients with severe brain trauma, a figure quietly stepped out of the internal service elevator, head bowed low, a medical mask covering most of his face. He walked through the cold hallway, past a few nurses tending to vital sign monitors, none of whom noticed the brand-new staff badge clipped to the white coat he wore. At the far end of the corridor, the door to room 319A stood slightly ajar, a steady beep echoing from within, each pulse slicing into the tense silence surrounding it. The man stepped inside, so gently that not a single strand of hair on the motionless woman's head stirred. Bryson Westfield stood beside his mother's hospital bed, his gaze settling on her bruised face and blood-matted silver hair. From the moment the plane landed to when he set foot in that room, no one had recognized him, but now, standing before the person clinging to her final breaths, he no longer had to wear the mask. It slipped off his face, and his hand reached out, lightly touching the back of her cold hand. A female doctor walking past the doorway froze when she saw him. She frowned, hesitated for a few seconds, then entered, her voice so soft it sounded like she feared hearing it herself. "You are?" Bryson turned to her, and the weight of his stare pulled the air from the room. There was no hatred in his eyes, only a restrained intensity that made breathing feel like a risk. He answered, each word clear. "I am the son of the victim." He paused, then added, voice even and steady, "And I will not leave until someone pays." The doctor said nothing. She turned away, leaving the man standing beside the bed like part of the room itself, still and untouchable. On the heart monitor, the rhythm continued slowly but with growing instability. The metrics indicated the patient was in deep critical condition, with prolonged coma threatening permanent loss of function. Bryson studied those numbers as if reviewing a battlefield report, where each signal conveyed life or death consequences. But this wasn't a combat unit. This was his mother, the woman who once stood in bomb-ridden zones to rescue wounded soldiers, who declined all privileges when he rose to general, who chose to live among the poor to teach children society had abandoned. And now, the very place she trusted had left her unconscious in the street, like discarded refuse. He pulled a phone from his pocket, entered a triple-level security code, and sent a short message. It wasn't a call for troop mobilization, nor a directive for punishment. It was a single internal command marked with absolute priority clearance. Initiate Protocol Ironstone. Full surveillance of all personnel involved, no rank exempted. From that moment, time logs, satellite pings, Intranet transactions, and even call histories of those connected began to be quietly backed up. A wordless trace operation had begun, no alarms, no headlines. It lay outside civilian law, operating within the military's most classified tier, where a mother's dignity is never paid for with apologies. And in that cold, white room, the man stood as if he had been born there. Among IV lines, monitors, and the beep of a ventilator, he didn't shed a single tear. But for the first time since donning the uniform, the eyes of a U.S. general were not aimed at an enemy, but fixed squarely on those who dared to call themselves defenders of justice. The city police headquarters had been under lockdown since early morning. Outside, traffic lights changed slowly, as if the entire system sensed something was off in the air. Inside, the fourth-floor hallway, reserved for high-level emergency meetings, was so silent that the wheels of an oxygen tank could be heard rolling in the distance. Cole Brennan was called at 8:13 a.m. He entered the meeting room with the awkward posture of a man trying to appear uninvolved. His uniform shirt was unpressed, tie hastily knotted, shoes still speckled with dry mud from rushing to the station after the call. A faint, forced smile sat on his lips, but the nerves in his throat twitched with fear. Inside the room, senior officers were already seated around a long, dark-wood table. Each wore an expression as cold as if attending a funeral, not for the dead, but for a career just set ablaze by its hand. Cole swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the faces, searching for any sign of allegiance. No one returned his gaze. He took a few more steps, then froze when he noticed two plainclothes federal officers at the far end of the room, hands near their hips, unmoving. He laughed, nervously, a sound so out of place it felt like he was trying to swallow his own words. I thought she was just some nameless old lady." No one answered. Not a cough, not a movement. Everyone waited. 10 seconds later, the rear door opened. The man who entered needed no introduction, no badge, no military flair to establish his rank. Just one footstep onto the tile was enough to draw the air from the room. General Bryson Westfield walked straight to the center, holding nothing but a slim folder. He didn't glance at anyone, didn't nod, didn't shake hands, and didn't pause at the head seat. He stood still, facing Cole, the space between them less than 10 feet, yet every second stretched like a silent standoff. Cole instinctively raised a hand to adjust his collar, then dropped it. He avoided the man's eyes, only to be caught in them. Eyes not fiery, not loud, but so cold they felt like they stripped flesh from bone. In that moment, every shell that had once allowed him to bark orders, to make civilians tuck away their phones in fear, to watch colleagues turn a blind eye, crumbled. He was no longer Captain Cole. He was just a man standing before a line he never imagined crossing. Westfield still hadn't spoken, but no one dared to fill the silence. From the deputy director to the chief of internal affairs, everyone felt as though they stood exposed in a courtroom that needed no jury. Because the evidence was blood, a fractured skull, a victim still unconscious in the hospital, and an identity the system thought would forever remain hidden. Westfield's voice finally broke the air. Slow, steady, barely above a murmur, yet powerful enough to make everyone straighten like soldiers in formation. "Who did you think my mother was?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "Just a poor old woman, discarded by society, or a mirror reflecting the fake power you all parade around so proudly?" Cole opened his mouth, stammering, "I didn't know. I thought—" "Exactly," Westfield cut in. "Because people like you never think you have to know. That's why you think you'll never pay the price." The file he carried was placed on the table. No one dared open it, but everyone knew it held more than documents. It held a verdict. The name Cole was no longer a signature at the bottom. It was the headline of an indictment. As the meeting neared its end, a general in a deep gray uniform approached Bryson Westfield, holding a thin folder but speaking with weight. "Does he know?" he asked. Bryson didn't look at him, only replied, "He knows, but it's already too late." The words echoed through the soundproofed room. Cole lowered his eyes, still gripping the table's edge like something might break loose if he let go. He had learned her identity, whispered through classified channels, shared in unsaved messages. But what shook him wasn't who she was. It was the silence in her son's eyes. Two federal officers entered from the back. No introductions, no explanation. One read briefly from a federal summons, then pulled out cuffs, silent, smooth, and meant for high-level targets. Cole sagged as they lifted him from his seat. He didn't resist. Another officer held a bag with his gun, badge, ID, and a scrap of paper with the quote, "I hit her head and it sounded like brick." The doors opened, sunlight pouring into the gray hallway. They led Cole down the same precinct corridor where he once gave orders. Now he walked hunched, hands cuffed as if crushed by his own words. Outside, hundreds had gathered. No signs, no chants, just phones raised and eyes watching. A woman whispered, "It's time." As Cole was escorted to the car, applause broke out. Slow, rising, steady, no shouting, no slogans, just the sound of silence breaking. On the third floor, a little girl asked her mother, "Is she awake yet?" No one replied. In the ICU, machines blinked, but Marlene Westfield hadn't stirred. Her eyes stayed closed, bruised, bandaged, still. Bryson stood beside her, holding her hand. He said nothing. A doctor started to enter, caught his gaze, and closed the door. Down below, Cole was driven into government custody. Above, a mother lay silent, and the only sound was the artificial pulse between two worlds, one that had collapsed and one still waiting to wait. Federal Court District 3 became the center of national attention within 48 hours of taking on the Marlene Westfield case. Lines formed early outside the courthouse. People without summons or legal duties, standing silently. They came with a shared belief. If justice was to be seen, it had to begin in the place that once refused to look. The hearing was meant to be closed, like most cases involving law enforcement, but over 10,000 signatures poured in within a single day, making privacy no longer an option. The Judiciary Committee held an emergency session. A senior federal judge experienced in civil rights cases was appointed. Inside the courtroom, cameras were mounted, not for broadcast, but as records for potential congressional reviews. The lead prosecutor, a white woman with a firm tone, began not with greetings but with a statement. "This is no longer about assault. This is an investigation into systemic abuse, protected by silence and complicity." Her words rippled across legal forums, news outlets, and classrooms nationwide. Evidence came not from street footage but from Cole's 8-year record. Dozens of complaints, most dismissed as insufficient, many resolved internally with suspiciously light sanctions. Reports had victim names altered to avoid detection. The first witness, a young black woman who once worked alongside Cole, described seeing him assault a man over a vehicle violation and being threatened to stay quiet. A retired officer testified next, pushed out for speaking up. Their stories matched old reports, audio leaks, and lost files. The courtroom's mood shifted, tension first, then outrage. But by the third day, when a list of ignored complaints was shown, silence took over. Every name was a warning that went unheeded. Every date marked a moment when power was chosen over truth. In the front row, Bryson Westfield sat still, eyes forward. No one needed his title to feel what his silence demanded: accountability. By the fourth day, the crowd outside grew larger. No banners, no chants, just people standing in quiet unity, a message clear without words. If justice exists, this is the moment it must step forward. Not just for an old woman, but for a generation whose voices were never heard. Cole was brought into the courtroom through a side door, wrists cuffed, his steps faltering as he faced the crowd. His expression blended confusion with defiance, as if trying to suggest he was the victim of some great misunderstanding. Standing at the defendant's stand, he held his chin high, but each glance toward the gallery revealed cracks in the facade. Fear had begun to seep in, visible in every twitch of his eyes. His defense attorney claimed Cole had followed protocol and that he had not known the victim's identity during the incident. But the prosecutor countered with a set of social media clips, videos showing Cole at parties, laughing, boasting. One showed him with a beard, declaring, "Slapped an old black lady today. Her head sounded like a brick." Another had him in a garage saying, "Those old black folks get scared easy." No expert was needed to confirm the voice and face on screen. The evidence was damning. The room went quiet. Jurors exchanged uneasy looks. Some spectators turned away, fists clenched. The court confirmed the footage was authentic, pulled from Cole's own devices. What was on trial now wasn't just violence. It was the mindset behind it. The pride in abusing power, the habit of treating cruelty as an accomplishment. National media followed the hearing closely. News outlets aired courtroom feeds alongside community reactions. Commentators noted that this case had captured everyone's attention, not for shock value, but because it hit a moral nerve. In a corner of the room, a young mother whispered, "This is why I don't let my kid play outside." A law student scribbled, "Trial of a broken culture." Even retired officers came, quietly watching a system forced to confront itself. The prosecutor looked straight at Cole. "You might think this is just one man," she said, "but the truth is the system knew and let him keep going. We're not only indicting him, we're indicting what protected him." The jury was dismissed to review all evidence, including altered reports and buried complaints. Before they left, the judge said clearly, "This court judges no one by skin color, but it will never excuse those who use it to justify harm." Outside, the crowd stood in silence, watching the courthouse gate where the words read, "Justice is not sentiment, it is duty." No cheering, no slogans, just quiet presence, as if to ensure that, this time, what was right would not be ignored. The elderly woman with silver hair, her hands slightly trembling, spoke with a voice that echoed strangely powerfully through the packed courtroom. When the judge asked if anyone wished to testify voluntarily, she stood up without hesitation. She did not look around or seek permission, only walked slowly toward the witness stand. A clerk tried to stop her, as she was not on the scheduled list, but the prosecutor gave a subtle nod. Everyone watched in silence, following the steps of the unknown woman. Seated, she took a deep breath, still clutching an old, faded photo. "My name is Eileen Harris, 73, widow. 3 years ago, he kicked me in the chest when I asked why my son was dragged from his car in front of his wife. That was the first time I saw my 5-year-old grandson cry out of fear." She paused, raising the photo as proof. "We didn't record it. We thought silence was safer. Who would believe a black child and an old woman?" Cole turned away, eyes on the floor. His slouched posture revealed the discomfort growing with every word. The prosecutor didn't interrupt. Mrs. Harris continued, "I wrote letters. No reply. I called the hotline. They told me to let it go. I've been ashamed ever since. But when I saw General Westfield's mother lying in that hospital bed, I couldn't stay quiet any longer." The court retrieved Mrs. Harris's case from old files, once dismissed as lacking sufficient grounds. Now, with a clear overlap between the officer's identity and the behavioral pattern, A map of past abuses began forming. Most cases shared the same traits. Black victims, often women or the elderly, and internal complaints halted at the department level. As Mrs. Harris stepped down, the audience stood in spontaneous applause, not because she was a hero, but because she had broken the habit of fear. A man in the second row spoke up. He threatened me, too. I'll testify if needed. A young woman holding her child nodded. We thought it was just us. Now we know how long we've been misled. The media broadcast updates live. That same afternoon, the court received 8 more testimonies involving Cole, all previously unreported. Voices long suppressed were finally heard, not because the system had changed, but because someone was brave enough to open the way. In the courtroom, Cole began to lose control. His attorney repeatedly requested breaks to stabilize his mental state, but the jurors' eyes had turned cold. They were not just listening to a case. They were seeing a system that had become a shield for abuse, and they understood that silence was no longer an option. The prosecutor returned to the podium holding an updated list of Cole's offenses over the past 8 years. We are not just trying one assault. We are confronting a past we chose to ignore. If anyone believes justice is revenge, this trial proves otherwise. This is not retaliation. This is a correction. The judge nodded, instructing the clerk to log the testimonies and forward the case to federal investigators for expansion. The trial was postponed 10 days to allow more witnesses and evidence. Before anyone left their seats, a voice from the back said softly but sharply, "We live in a time when one person speaking up can make justice shift." That day, Eileen Harris was that person. A middle-aged man with a wrinkled shirt, hollow cheeks, and tired eyes stepped forward after Mrs. Harris. His name was Ronald Dupree, a former librarian who retired early after an unspoken incident. "I filmed him hitting a kid at an intersection," he said, holding a cracked phone with shaking hands. "But before I could save it, Cole snatched it, smashed it, and threatened to show me what resisting looked like." The room fell silent. Ronald looked around and added, this time without hesitation, "I've been afraid for years, but now it's enough." Ronald's testimony was the first crack in the thick wall of silence. After him, an elderly woman named Lena Watson asked to speak. She walked with a cane, nearly blind, but recalled every detail. "Cole once grabbed me at a bus stop just because I asked him to speak more gently to a young mother holding a baby. When I responded, he spat on the ground and said, 'Why let old ladies like you wander the streets anyway?'" Her words were plain, unedited, but carried weight because they were truths long buried beneath cleaned-up reports. One by one, people came forward. No one knew who they were, but each carried a memory once forgotten, now returned to the light. A war veteran, who had lost an eye in Iraq, stood in a faded coat and said quietly, "I thought my service would earn me respect, but when Cole shoved me down the steps just for being slow to show ID, I realized skin color comes before medals." National television began cutting regular programs to stream the trial live. International outlets covered it too, calling it an unprecedented wave of witnesses in a U.S. civil hearing. The media showed long lines of the elderly, the poor, the legally abandoned, now queuing at the courthouse, hoping to reclaim truths once dismissed. Local authorities, overwhelmed at first, had to assign more staff to receive statements. A volunteer legal team was urgently formed to compile, verify, and forward new cases to federal court. On social media, the hashtag #SpeakForHer went viral, inspired by Marlene's case and Harris's testimony. In less than 2 days, over 100,000 posts shared overlooked stories. People began connecting through a single shared question: what did we stay silent for? Inside the courtroom, Cole sat with his head bowed. The arrogance was gone. No more excuses. When his lawyer requested a recess, citing social pressure beyond reasonable control, the judge denied it. "The pressure your client feels," she said calmly, "is the natural response of a society hearing truth for the first time from those once forced to stay quiet." Applause followed, not for vengeance, but for recognition. In the back row, Bryson Westfield remained still. He did not speak, interfere with, or guide anyone. He simply watched, like a man witnessing the very system that once shielded the guilty now face its sins. What brought him peace was not Cole's exposure, but that his mother, though still unconscious, had revived the courage that had long been ignored. Outside the courthouse, people began placing hand-drawn signs that read, "I saw, I will speak." What began as a trial of abuse had become something greater, a reckoning told not through books, but through memories once silenced, now returned to history. The courtroom fell silent after the prosecutor's remark. Though brief, his words left a deep imprint on every mind present. Marlene's place in society had never appeared on any official document, but the way she had lived and the price she had paid became a solemn reminder to the entire legal system listening. A society is not measured by how it treats the powerful, the prosecutor continued, looking directly at the jury, but by how it treats those it deems invisible. He then turned to Cole, who was no longer a police officer but simply a defendant, facing an undeniable truth. The defense attorney stood, trying to maintain a composed tone. "My client did not know she was the mother of General Bryson Westfield," he stated, emphasizing each word as if trying to separate action from consequence. What he did, though reprehensible, stemmed from a lack of information, not malicious intent. A murmur rippled through the public gallery. The attorney raised his hand to restore order, then added, "And so we ask the jury to judge this as a mistake in judgment, not as a response to public outrage." The jury's reaction was a heavy silence. Not because they agreed or disagreed, but because a larger question had begun to take form. Can ignorance be a legal excuse for assaulting an elderly woman? Does not knowing someone's status truly lessen the responsibility of the one who inflicted the harm? A retired high school teacher on the jury wrote later in her journal, "They say he didn't know who she was, but isn't the most terrifying part that he didn't need to know who she was to decide to hurt her?" During cross-examination, the prosecutor introduced a series of recordings and old images showing Cole in similar incidents. In one, he shoved a 14-year-old boy for not hearing a question. In another, he shouted at an elderly woman who couldn't follow his instructions fast enough. In another, he seized a black man's phone while being recorded, offering no legal justification. None of those victims had high-profile identities, and so they were once overlooked, until Marlene Westfield appeared on the list, not because of whom she gave birth to, but because someone finally refused to stay silent. The defense shifted toward a procedural attack. The attorney claimed the media had unfairly shaped public perception and requested the trial be dismissed due to a prejudicial environment caused by public pressure. The judge immediately denied the motion. "We cannot call it unfair just because voices long ignored are finally being heard," she said. "Justice is not the absence of noise. It is the courage to confront what we once chose to look away from." Outside, protests continued, but now with more than anger. Legal aid booths were set up to encourage victims of police abuse to come forward. Law schools hosted mock hearings centered on Marlene's case, exploring deeper questions of power and dignity. Many stopped naming Cole. They called it the trial for the forgotten. As the trial unfolded, Cole seemed smaller, not only because of who he had attacked, but because what followed forced the public to ask, how many other Marlenans have been left behind? And if today was the day justice was finally called by its name, it was not because of titles or power. It was because, for the first time, those who had no voice were finally allowed to stand on the witness stand, with every truth, and with a kind of courage that had never before been acknowledged. As soon as the statement was released, national media cut regular programming for a special report. The quote from the U.S. military's top commander appeared without commentary or imagery, just one line on the screen. "It's because she was nobody that they dared to act." It didn't need context. It sounded like a verdict. One delivered not against a person, but against a culture built on unchecked power and assumed immunity. No campaign was needed for it to spread. High schools changed debate topics to ask, is being a nobody society's greatest injustice? A law school launched a forum titled Between Wrong and the Unprotected, using the military's words as evidence that moral lines had been crossed. In Congress, a representative stood and repeated the quote, "They acted not because they knew her, but because they believed she was no one." he said. And if we keep ignoring those we think are nobody, it won't be just names we lose, it will be our democracy. At an elementary school in Marlene's neighborhood, children were asked to draw someone unremembered but unforgettable. One girl drew a woman in a brown cardigan holding books, standing in a littered schoolyard. In the corner, she wrote, "She swept with my mom and told her to go back to school." The quote spread across cities on protest signs, T-shirts, flyers, and chalked outside police stations, not as a threat, but as a line society vowed not to cross again. Cole, still in custody, asked his lawyer, "Why is everyone making a big deal? Just because she's somebody's mom?" That question lit a new fire. A radio journalist responded, "No, Mr. Cole. People care not because of whose mother she is, but because for too long we thought silence was enough. Now that silence is broken, it's her nobody status that makes your actions unforgivable." The Justice Department ordered a full review of police abuse cases from the past 5 years, starting with states showing high elderly assault rates. A special task force was formed, led by someone who had once served with Marlene. At the briefing, he said, "She saved lives in war without asking names. Now I'll honor her by asking for every name we once ignored." Across the country, the shift was clear. This wasn't a protest. It was a reckoning. The question changed from who did wrong to who did we leave behind. And in every retold memory, Marlene, an ordinary woman with no title or medal, became a symbol, not because she stood out, but because the world finally understood the cost of thinking she didn't. Each post was shared under a single headline. What was their name? There were no profile pictures, just a paragraph, a name, a date, and a forgotten act. One man recounted the year his mother was shoved to the ground for asking about her husband's follow-up appointment. A young woman wrote about her grandmother, whose bag was emptied by police in a public market, then had to plead not to be taken to the station. These stories did not appear as accusations, but as belated testimonies from a society long accustomed to overlooking the vulnerable. A website titled Say Her Name was quickly created by the online community, but its interface was unlike typical campaigns. The background was pale gray, no logos, no Share Now button. Each story appeared as slow scrolling text, narrated in a real, recorded voice, whispering back the memory that had once been pushed aside. There was no added background music because those who built the site believed that if pain was real enough, it needed no soundtrack to echo loudly. An independent journalist who had once lived near where Marlene taught was the first to upload a series of initial entries. He wrote, "I used to think she was just a kind woman. But when I reviewed records of violence over the past 10 years, I realized her kindness wasn't a choice. It was resistance." That quote was repeated in many evening news broadcasts, not as breaking news, but as a public reflection by the media itself. How many times had they ignored those without titles? Universities began adding special modules to their media curricula. Students were assigned to rewrite interviews with individuals without social power, and analyzed why those stories had never made it on air. Many chose to write about Marlene, but the deeper they looked, the more they uncovered dozens of others who had suffered similar abuse, leaving no trace behind. Those collected accounts became part of official teaching materials, not to dissect death, but to end the silence before death repeated itself. In churches, Sunday sermons introduced a new theme. Who was the person you never asked the name of? Pastors invited their congregations to recall someone they had once seen hurt, someone quiet they had never reached out to. At a small chapel in Virginia, the entire congregation spent 20 minutes reading each name printed from the Say Her Name website, with no commentary, no music, no breaks. The website itself had no comment section or sharing feature. Its creators left only one message at the bottom: "We don't need to go viral, we need to remember." That line, in an interview, was quoted by Marlene's son. Looking straight into the camera, he said, "My mother taught me to read by asking me to repeat the names in our history books, but she always paused to ask, 'And who will remember the ones with no name?'" The internal investigation expanded. Dozens of former police departments were ordered to review their stored footage, while civil rights lawyers partnered with tech teams to launch an AI project to to identify unreported acts of violence. Preliminary findings revealed at least 312 clips that had never been filed, each with the same traits: elderly victims, no resistance, and no mention in any official report. Beneath each story on the site, there was a small handwritten note marked by a symbol. This name was once overlooked, but now you're reading it. And as people scrolled through that long list, no one asked, whose mother was she? Instead, they whispered something far more important. If she were my mother, I wouldn't have let that happen. And in that moment, a name didn't need to be famous to move an entire generation. That morning's history class began like usual, with dusty timelines on the board and bored glances at famous names. Then a student brought in a printed copy of the federal prosecutor's statement, where Marlene was cited as a moral line in the justice system. He stood and asked to read aloud. His voice cut through the silence. The victim had no place on the map of power, but she marked the line between right and wrong. The class turned toward the teacher. She didn't stop her tears. "Why didn't we learn this sooner?" she asked, voice trembling. That question echoed online. How many stories of justice were lost because no one told them? A group of young teachers gathered case materials, proposing that they be added to high school civics. Their focus wasn't on glorifying one person, but on how society responds to wrong, and why silence had been seen as neutrality. In another state, a veteran posted, "I once guarded this country's borders, but it's our elders who need guarding from the police." His post went viral. Underneath, people shared stories, moments they witnessed abuse, stayed silent, and thought the system would fix itself. Now, they understood why silence only empowers the worst. A retired officer group called for mandatory ethics training in every law enforcement program. Their proposal stated, "The most important skill in uniform isn't shooting or shouting, it's knowing when to stop and see who's in front of you." The quote was aired on national TV alongside footage of Marlene teaching a child to read. Veterans began meeting with families of victims. One soldier said, "I was trained to know enemies. No one taught me to tell reflex from prejudice. That should have come first." His son stepped up, hand on his shoulder. "She wouldn't blame your silence," he said, "but she'd want you to break it, starting now." Police academies launched a pilot program. Cadets had to write about an abuse case not covered by major media. Essays were graded not on references, but on honesty. Each was asked one question. "The last time you ignored something wrong, what did you tell yourself to feel okay?" From a single case, Marlene's story sparked change. From schools to courts, from classrooms to command posts. The shift wasn't just about Cole's trial. It was a reckoning spreading like ink across old assumptions. Now, when someone asks, "Why wasn't she protected?" the answer no longer stumbles, it stands. Not with a nameplate or a headline, but with the simple promise, never again. The verdict was delivered on a mid-month afternoon in a courtroom packed to capacity. National media covered the event live, while outside the courthouse, hundreds of citizens stood silently along the walkway, holding signs and quiet tributes. Garrett Cole, once confident no one would dare touch him, listened to every word the judge read aloud. Aggravated assault resulting in serious bodily harm, falsifying claims against a civilian, obstruction of a federal investigation, and fabrication of evidence. His eyes drifted toward the spectator seats, where some of those watching were former colleagues, men who had once patted him on the back when a black person was pulled over for no reason at all. But the court session did not end with Cole's sentence. The judge tapped the bench lightly, turned to the prosecutor, and requested that evidence be presented regarding others who were complicit or who enabled the internal mishandling of the case. A long list was read out loud, including not just subordinates who stayed silent, but individuals on the initial investigative team who deliberately overlooked evidence, altered original files to minimize severity, or directly intimidated witnesses through demotions, schedule changes, or psychological pressure. The first name called was Ray Mitchell, who had been visible in the assault footage and made no attempt to intervene. According to a statement from a rookie officer, Ray had personally requested a key segment be removed from the original report, claiming it had no prosecutorial value. Following him was a mid-ranking officer named Lorena Brooks, discovered to have recorded internal hearing meetings and shared them with the defense to help Cole evade questioning during the preliminary trial. These individuals were brought before the court together, facing charges of abuse of authority in obstructing a federal investigation. The atmosphere in the courtroom thickened. Those who had believed this to be an isolated case were now confronted with the truth. This was a snapshot of a system built on avoidance and mutual protection. On a large screen, the prosecution displayed a timeline diagram linking each involved individual, with detailed markers showing how the cover-up had unfolded systematically. A few jurors subtly shook their heads as they saw names once praised in exemplary service ceremonies now listed as key players in the concealment. When invited to speak, the prosecutor emphasized, cover-ups don't happen in the dark. They happen in broad daylight, right where people believe they're being protected, and silence is no longer a moral dilemma. It's a choice with legal consequences. That line later appeared in headlines across major publications, serving as a pointed warning to law enforcement that justice could no longer yield to institutional inertia. A moment that quieted the entire courtroom came when the judge played a recording of Cole speaking with a former colleague, laughing and saying, "I used to think old folks like her couldn't do anything. Turns out, the old ones are the real threat." No one laughed, because that remark was no longer a joke. It was living proof of the contempt that had been normalized inside the force. Before sentencing those implicated, the judge closed with a single, resolute statement. Corrupt systems do not begin with cruelty. They begin with the silent agreement. Today, this court ends that agreement. And as the courtroom doors closed, many understood this wasn't merely the end of a trial. It was the beginning of a reckoning, where those who once looked away now had to face the truth they had long avoided. The special report was released less than 24 hours after the verdict. Approved by the Department of Justice and the Office of the Federal Inspector General, it ordered all state and federal police departments to review every case involving intervention, pursuit, or forced contact with citizens aged 65 and older over the past 10 years. The order demanded more than statistics. It required cause analysis, context review, and identification of any signs of excessive force. Any case delayed or misreported would be subject to criminal investigation. Departments in cities like Philadelphia, Austin, and Sacramento immediately redirected resources to filter old data. Cases previously closed due to lack of clear evidence were reopened, now with a different lens, not asking if the victim resisted but whether the officer had abused their authority. Many in law enforcement grew uneasy, not because they were directly involved, but because they knew one thing: what used to be accepted as normal was no longer acceptable. At an emergency conference led by the Federal Police Academy, legal and human rights experts issued new guidelines to distinguish reflex from unconscious bias. One instructor stated, "The problem has never been the tool. It's how far the person holding it believes they have the right to go." That line spread across forums, reshaping how future officers were taught that self-defense cannot justify every inhumane choice. Garrett Cole's sentencing was filed into the National Legal Database with a special notation. In the judge's opinion, one line was bolded. "This court does not punish the outcome. It convicts the choice to act when restraint was due." Once seen as a verdict's close, that sentence became headline commentary. The idea of choice became a new test for public conduct. In moments without orders or witnesses, an officer's real character is revealed, and that moment could cost them their honor forever. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers introduced a bill to revise qualified immunity for law enforcement. Pressured by the case, several states pledged to end their use as a shield for ethical misconduct. A senator from Georgia said bluntly, "We let a system stand too long on the belief that those in uniform are always right. But this case proves the opposite, that blind faith is what enabled wrongdoing." When asked whether the verdict was swayed by the victim's son, a federal spokesperson replied, "What makes this ruling matter is not who she was, but that even if she had been no one, the verdict would be the same. In that moment, many understood justice was not about a victim's status, but the refusal to tolerate power used to harm, no matter who stood on the receiving end. And so, the story didn't end with a verdict. It became a landmark, a sweeping audit, a line drawn between what is right and what is merely allowed. Because sometimes justice doesn't ask who was wrong, but who dares to say, "This wrong ends here." In cities big and small, black and white papers began appearing. No logos, no names. Just a line printed at the bottom. You have the right to live, not because you are someone's mother. These papers weren't dated, weren't signed, and weren't viral on social media, but within days they were everywhere, in train stations, clinics, and senior centers. No one claimed credit. No one took them down. A doctor in Boston saw one taped to his clinic door. He was about to remove it, then stopped. Inside, 6 elderly patients waited, silent, watching him. He folded the page and said, "Leave it." In Brooklyn, an older woman read it, then asked, "I thought only people with power got protected. Maybe that's changing." In San Diego, a group of women saw it outside their fitness class and began sharing quiet stories of being dismissed, denied, and degraded. One said softly, "Maybe it's time we write. Send it somewhere. Starting today." No speeches, no campaigns, but the words began to spread. Justice, not from courts, but from those once overlooked, finding strength in each other. It didn't need banners, just timing and truth. Observers called it a quiet wave, not led by politics, but by people. Everyday actions, small papers, whispered truths. And somehow, that was enough to start something real. A journalist once wrote, "Systems don't change with the loudest marches. They change when invisible people realize they deserve dignity." No one needed to know who wrote the line. What mattered was that it arrived, right on time. In a public school outside the city, a history teacher taped one of those papers on the whiteboard. No words, just a handwritten note. "This week, we learn about fairness, not by definition, but by feeling." The class went silent, not because they understood, but because something in them did. The lesson that day did not begin with a standard curriculum. She didn't mention any president's name or open a textbook. Instead, she played a 4-minute video showing the courtroom confrontation where the prosecutor presented undeniable evidence of Cole's violence and the systemic cover-up. After the clip ended, she turned off the screen and faced the class. The air felt thick, as if someone had sealed the room and drained away all sound. A student in the back row raised their hand, voice quiet but clear. If she hadn't been the mother of a general, would this have gone public? The question wasn't meant to be answered, but to open another space, where students no longer simply absorbed information, but became those who posed the questions. Ms. Bennett nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting quiet respect. "That's why I'm not teaching you definitions today." Word of that single sentence quickly spread beyond the classroom. Another literature teacher at a nearby school printed the line and taped it to the cover of their lesson plan. A school over 300 miles away used it as a prompt for their weekend essay. Then a group of parents shared an image of the sentence on social media, untouched, with no hashtags or citations, and yet somehow everyone who saw it understood. It wasn't just a reminder, it was a quiet In a small community library in Vermont, the librarian posted that same line above a shelf labeled Civic Ethics. Below were books neither new nor famous, but often borrowed, with penciled notes in the margins. This part made me rethink everything. An elderly man stopped by, read the line, and stood silent for a long time. As he turned to leave, he said to someone nearby, "I thought I understood fairness. Now I think maybe I only understood half." No one commanded that message to spread. There was no figurehead, no media campaign, no budget behind it, but each person, from teacher to reader, from student to veteran, saw it and knew what came next. They didn't call each other by name, didn't organize rallies or chant slogans. They simply left the words wherever they might reach someone else. On classroom whiteboards, meeting room doors, the back page of a morning bulletin. Its reach came not from volume, but from depth, because when fairness stops being defined by textbook terms and is instead felt through ordinary moments, that's when real change begins. And when such unclaimed words continue to be copied, pinned up, and quietly remain in the corners of daily life, society shifts. It becomes a place where even a slip of unsigned paper can make someone pause and start to rethink everything. At a public university in the eastern United States, a group of senior sociology students presented their graduation thesis titled Community Responses to Injustice Against the Elderly. The defense was originally scheduled in a small room, but so many students and faculty showed up that the event had to be moved to the main auditorium. None of the group members had expected that a topic inspired by a news report on the Cole trial would draw such attention. One of the presenters, a student named Amara, opened by showing short clips from the federal prosecutor's closing remarks. She didn't offer commentary, just played the footage and then said, "We didn't begin this project to condemn anyone. We just wanted to understand what made a silent community finally speak up, and why that voice began with someone no longer young." The room fell silent, quiet enough to hear the pages turning as an elderly professor reviewed the thesis. The presentation lasted over 30 minutes, blending survey data, media analysis, and testimony from elderly individuals who had appeared in court. They never mentioned Cole by name and avoided accusatory language. Instead, the group focused on how society moved from silence to reaction, from isolated individuals to shared empathy. Another student, Daniel, concluded, "The woman who was attacked never asked to be a symbol, but society's response showed that what people needed was someone they simply couldn't ignore." When it was time for feedback, the faculty advisor didn't give a grade. He stepped down from the judging panel, walked to the front, and said, "I won't assign a score to this. Not because it lacks quality, but because grades can't measure the real worth of what you've done." He paused, then added, "I believe what you're building here may become educational material in the future, not just a graduation paper." His words quickly spread across academic circles. Professors from other universities reached out to request permission to use the thesis in their classrooms. A national student conference invited the group to speak about their process. What caught attention wasn't just the content, but their tone. No drama, no exploitation of pain, only respect for each story shared. A week later, the group received an email from a federal human rights organization proposing that they turn the project into a pilot curriculum for high schools. For the first time, students who once only worried about graduating on time began discussing long-term research. They no longer cared about transcripts or scholarships. They focused on crafting content that would help 15 and 16-year-olds understand that injustice isn't just an adult problem, it's a societal one. Amara once wrote in her journal, "I used to think we were learning how to analyze society. Turns out we were learning how to change it, one story at a time." That sentence was later printed on the cover of a booklet they compiled and distributed within local schools. No one in the group saw themselves as doing something grand. They were simply restoring what society seemed to have forgotten: respect for the elderly, and for those who don't need to stand out to deserve protection. At a federal police academy in Virginia, a cadet named Elias Wren walked into the training director's office late one afternoon. Sunlight slanted through the glass, hitting the wooden desk where the director was reviewing internal reports. Elias stood tall in full uniform, though his eyes betrayed a quiet turmoil. He placed a withdrawal form on the desk, resigning his scholarship and leaving school in his final semester. When the director looked up, Elias simply said, "I used to think reflex was the most essential part of this job, but if that reflex puts harmless people in the hospital, maybe I'm learning the wrong thing." His file was later sent to the career counseling department. He wasn't expelled or pressured by the school, but his decision sparked debate. Some veteran instructors were disappointed, saying the younger generation was too sensitive to public opinion, but others quietly agreed, especially after Cole's verdict was made public. Elias wasn't the only one whose beliefs had been shaken. He was just the first to step out of line. Around the same time, a post without a name began spreading across a police officer's forum. It had no images, no hashtags, and didn't reference any specific case, but its opening line stopped readers cold. If you've ever hit someone just because they were weaker and couldn't fight back, you don't deserve to wear this uniform. Within 24 hours, it had been shared thousands of times, appearing in everything from internal groups to public security pages. Some called it an incitement against the force, but most remained silent, stunned by how deeply it rang true. A longtime supervisor in Oregon later said, "I don't know who wrote that, but I know they spoke for everyone who's ever stood in a holding room wondering, have I stayed silent too long?" The comments that followed weren't angry but almost confessional, admitting how the profession had prioritized restraint skills and forgotten self-restraint. In a small Illinois town, the police department's HR head held a closed-door meeting. No speeches, just 3 printed questions placed in every locker. When was the last time you used force? Could the person defend themselves? And if it happened to you today, how would you respond? Those questions weren't meant to be answered aloud, only read before every shift. In a quiet hospital room in Maryland, Mrs. Marlene sat by the window, watching the garden. Her health had improved, but she avoided the press, declined interviews, and asked her family not to release any photos. When a famous journalist tried to reach her through her son, she simply said, "I have no story to tell. People only see when they choose to open their eyes." Awards and titles came from many directions, all sent back without explanation. She didn't attend public events, didn't give speeches, and stayed off the posters that declared, "Every elder is a living witness." Her only request was that the hospital let only Bryson speak on her behalf. At a local community center, organizers prepared a memorial for elderly victims whose names were never known. Blank signs read, "My name is," waiting to be filled. When asked why Marlene's name wasn't included, one volunteer replied, "Because she never called herself a victim, we won't label her." Even as state agencies and military officials reached out, her answer never changed. A colonel once offered her a medal. Bryson quietly replied, "She doesn't need a medal to know she was right. She just wants peace." And though her name never made the news or the monuments, she drew a quiet line between being seen and being used. When asked why she chose silence, Bryson always answered, "My mother believes what's right doesn't need a stage. It just needs to be done." And that silence, in the end, said everything. At the entrance of a police department in Illinois, once tied to multiple abuse complaints, a white sheet of paper was taped to the door. Bold letters, no logo, no name. "The family seeks no honor. Justice does not need a frame to stand tall." The words, from General Westfield's office, stopped people in their tracks. A young officer paused, then walked into a meeting on revising emergency protocols for the elderly. In several states, departments placed the message beside duty boards as a quiet but firm reminder. Some removed it days later, citing internal media approval, but others kept it, even framed it. In Nebraska, it sat beside a chair where an elderly woman was once insulted for asking about her husband's detention. At training academies, the quote began opening lectures on ethics. A Virginia instructor used it to start class. "Today, we discuss limits, not of behavior, but of pride and power." The room was still. No charts, just questions. If there's no frame, can justice still be seen? The media shifted too. Reports turned into round tables where former law enforcement leaders reflected on change. A retired federal chief said, "That sentence kept me up. I thought honor was what's on record. Now I know it's taking responsibility without needing your name known." In the Western Tri-State meeting, leaders debated adding the quote to conduct codes. One said, "If a single sentence can make us pause, it belongs everywhere." At a New Jersey library, students used it for a civics talk, showing only the names and stories of elderly victims. When asked why, one said, "Because justice isn't decoration, it's what we live by." And somehow, the quieter the message spread, the more people understood what it meant. Marlene's house sat quietly behind a row of old trees, tucked in a narrow alley. There were no signs, no camera, no plaque. Though she once stood at the center of a national reckoning, her life remained unchanged. Simple, calm and deliberate. To neighbors unaware of the news, she was just the woman on the porch with a book and a bonsai. Each morning, she watered her plants and turned the pages of American history or old novels, never rushing. Then, one day, a little girl approached her with a book in hand. "What does this word mean?" the girl asked shyly. Marlene smiled, offered her a seat, and replied, "One word at a time. Don't rush. What matters is knowing what you're reading." Soon, her porch became a quiet stop for local kids. Some came to ask questions, others just to sit. She didn't teach. She listened. One boy told his mother, "I like Mrs. Marlene's house. She doesn't get mad when I read wrong. She just asks what I think it means." Her porch became a space where curiosity was met with respect, not correction. A neighbor once saw her surrounded by children and said, "The court stood for you, but I think these kids are your clearest legacy." Marlene only smiled. "I'm just sitting here, like I always have." When asked to write a memoir or speak on TV, she declined. "That story doesn't belong to me anymore," she told a journalist. "It belongs to those who began asking questions after seeing it." And in a country where silence often erases people, her quiet presence remained. No guards, no gates. Just a porch, a few books, and the sound of children reading. Neighbors didn't call her a hero or a symbol. They called her what they always had: Mrs. Marlene, the one who gives out cookies and never yells at the kids. A young journalist, new to the field, once came to interview Mrs. Marlene and began with, "As someone who bravely stood up, what do you think your role is in changing society?" Mrs. Marlene looked at her, not judgmental, not evasive. She replied softly, "I didn't stand up to change anything. I just once fell, and this time I chose not to stay silent when I got back up." The journalist stayed quiet for a while, then put her recorder away and politely excused herself. Not long after, a portrait of Mrs. Marlene appeared in the hallway of a local elementary school. There was no quote beneath it, no biography, just 4 words: "Listen without judgment." The drawing wasn't submitted for approval or hung during any ceremony. It was hand-delivered by a group of 3rd graders to the school library, with a note, "This is our Mrs. Marlene." That lack of embellishment was exactly what made Mrs. Marlene so special, not because she avoided media, but because she lived in a way that left no room for fame to slip in. To those who had felt her kindness, she was known for small but profound gestures, a timely word of encouragement, a hug without reason, or a clean handkerchief offered to a stranger on the bus, wiping away tears. A boy who grew up in the neighborhood, now a college senior, wrote in his final paper, "I used to think people who changed society had to be politicians, leaders, someone holding a microphone. Then I remembered Mrs. Marlene, the woman who always sat on the same wooden bench, who taught me how to tell the difference between selfishness and courage. She never said the word justice, but because of her, I understood why it mattered." At the bus stop near her home, people started painting simple images: a chair, a plant, and a teacup. Below each one, in handwritten script, it read, "For those who learned kindness from someone who never gave a lecture." No names, no claims of authorship. Yet those images began appearing everywhere, in waiting areas, library corners, and local clinics. And whenever someone asked who painted this, neighbors simply smiled and said, "Probably someone who once got cookies from Mrs. Marlene." It started with what looked like just another act of senseless violence. A cop hit an elderly black woman in public, not out of fear, not because she was a threat, but because in his eyes she was a nobody. Marlene had no rank, no title, no phone to record. She became a target simply for existing in a society that measured dignity by power. This could have been forgotten, like thousands of cases before, but this time, someone spoke up, then another, and more. Ordinary people, once silenced or erased, stood in court to testify. They weren't activists or leaders, just citizens who finally saw themselves in a mother who was beaten without a name. The trial exposed something deeper: the idea that dignity belongs only to the powerful. The defense said, "He didn't know who she was." But that's the problem. If she hadn't been the mother of a high-ranking official, would anyone have believed her? Without video or public pressure, would her story have mattered? Justice didn't come with medals or speeches. It came in how the community responded. Kids reading court transcripts at school, teachers crying, veterans questioning the badge. A cadet quit, realizing reflexes without ethics can kill. And children began to look at the lady with cookies with a respect that didn't need explaining. No statues were built. Her family refused all honors. But a wall was raised at the Federal Academy. No name, no face, no words. Still, cadets stop and place their hands on it. When asked who the wall is for, someone says, for those beaten because they were nobody. And maybe that's where justice truly begins, not in court, but in choosing to stand with the powerless, even when all they have is their existence. Though Mrs. Marlene never gave a public speech and never accepted any accolades, her story spread farther than any news broadcast. She didn't need to become a symbol. Yet what happened to her became a measure of how society treats the vulnerable. Her silence was not passive. It was composed, unwavering, and it forced an entire system to reevaluate itself, not because she was someone's mother, but because she should never have been treated like someone with no name. If one elderly woman could become the reason thousands spoke up, the reason laws changed, the reason stone walls were raised without names etched into them, then perhaps the most important part isn't in her past, but in how we treat the next person. The lesson didn't come from a speech. It came from every response afterward, whether we pause to help, whether we step back instead of striking, whether we stand on the right side when no one clapped. The small wall at the academy needs no introduction because everyone walking past already understands. Justice doesn't live in chants or declarations. It lives in the moment you choose not to turn away.